The mansion stood like a monument to luxury, its polished marble floors gleaming beneath crystal chandeliers, while expensive cars lined the driveway like trophies of success. To the outside world, the millionaire's life appeared flawless, a picture of triumph built on wealth, power, and influence. He attended exclusive galas, shook hands with dignitaries, and was photographed in glossy magazines beside his radiant, pregnant wife, who carried herself with quiet grace. Together, they were admired as a power couple, the embodiment of love and prosperity. Every social circle whispered about their fortune and envied their lifestyle, convinced they had everything others could only dream of. Behind the sparkle, however, a different story lingered. The wife, devoted and gentle, poured her heart into the marriage, supporting her husband through his endeavors and preparing herself for motherhood with hope and anticipation. She decorated the nursery, wrote letters to their unborn child, and envisioned a future filled with laughter and stability. Her devotion was unquestionable, her love unconditional, but she often found herself alone in that vast house, longing for the man who was slipping further away into his empire of deals, power games, and fleeting thrills. The millionaire's charm dazzled outsiders, yet at home it sometimes curdled into arrogance. Small cracks began to show, invisible to the cameras but sharp to the woman who shared his bed. A dismissive tone, a forgotten promise, a late night explained with vague excuses, all whispered of distance growing between them. He seemed more enthralled with the image of success than with the reality of family. The wife, though cherished in public, began to sense that behind the grand displays of affection, there was a hollow space where intimacy once lived. What the world saw was a perfect marriage. What lay beneath was a fragile illusion, waiting to shatter. While the world saw her as nothing more than the elegant, dutiful wife of a wealthy man, beneath her calm exterior lay a secret identity that even her arrogant husband failed to notice. She had always been intelligent and observant, qualities overshadowed by her husband's booming presence. He often dismissed her opinions on business matters, claiming finance and deals were a man's world, but she quietly absorbed knowledge, watching and learning from the sidelines. Late at night, while he entertained business partners or indulged in social events, she sat at her desk, researching markets, reading financial reports, and studying trends that most people overlooked. Her sharp mind became her greatest weapon. Starting with modest investments under a different name, she grew her portfolio discreetly, carefully reinvesting profits and diversifying into promising industries. Real estate, technology startups, renewable energy, her reach expanded steadily, each decision calculated with precision. What began as a quiet pursuit soon transformed into an empire hidden in plain sight. She built connections with influential investors who respected her insight, many of whom never suspected she was the very woman pictured on magazine covers beside the pompous millionaire. Keeping her identity hidden wasn't just strategy, it was survival. She understood her husband's nature, controlling, prideful, and quick to belittle anything that might challenge his dominance. Revealing her success would only provoke his arrogance or jealousy, and she had no interest in feeding his ego. Instead, she chose silence, letting him believe she was simply the devoted wife who spent her days shopping, attending luncheons, and preparing for motherhood. In truth, she was steadily building a legacy greater than his own, one not rooted in superficial displays of wealth but in real, lasting power. Every stock purchase, every business partnership, every strategic move brought her closer to a security he could never take away from her or their unborn child. While he flaunted his wealth at parties, she safeguarded their future in ways he couldn't even imagine. And though he viewed her as dependent, the reality was starkly different. She was the silent architect of her own destiny, waiting for the day her hidden power would come to light. As the months of her pregnancy unfolded, the cracks in their marriage deepened into painful fissures. The man who once held her hand with pride now seemed distant, his affection replaced by a coldness that stung more than words ever could. He grew increasingly absorbed in his business ventures, often returning home late, offering only curt explanations, or ignoring her altogether as if her presence were secondary to his empire. The once shared laughter around the dinner table faded into silence, broken only by the clinking of his glass or the tapping of his phone. With his arrogance growing unchecked, he began to treat her less like a partner and more like a possession, someone to display at events for appearances but control behind closed doors. Decisions about the household, finances, even her own health were made with little regard for her voice. He questioned her choices, dismissed her suggestions, and masked his disregard with a patronizing tone that belittled her intelligence. Her pregnancy, instead of bringing them closer, seemed to widen the gap. As her body grew heavier with the weight of their child, she longed for comfort, reassurance, and presence. Instead, she was met with neglect, his coldness leaving her to face the emotional and physical struggles alone. Behind his polished smile in public, his dismissive attitude at home cut deeper each day. The man she had loved seemed to be vanishing, replaced by someone intoxicated with power and control. She endured in silence, clutching her belly for strength, knowing that while he withdrew, her determination to protect herself and her unborn child only grew stronger. The perfect marriage was unraveling, thread by thread. She arrived quietly at first, a new face at business gatherings and social events, introduced under the guise of being an assistant, a consultant, or simply a friend. But her presence was impossible to ignore. The mistress possessed a magnetic charm, a confidence wrapped in beauty that drew attention wherever she went. Her laughter was deliberate, her gaze calculated, and her every move designed to catch the eye of powerful men. To the millionaire, already blinded by arrogance and hungry for validation, she was an intoxicating distraction. What began as subtle glances and whispered conversations soon became brazen displays of affection. He invited her to dinners where his wife once sat by his side, choosing instead to bask in the admiration of this younger, bolder woman. Friends and associates noticed the shift, their raised eyebrows and knowing smiles feeding his ego rather than shaming him. The wife, pregnant and weary, was forced to endure the humiliation of watching her husband flaunt the affair in public spaces where whispers traveled quickly. At charity galas, where she had once been the star at his side, she now found herself standing alone as he paraded the mistress with a smug pride, ignoring the pain etched on his wife's face. At business events, the mistress leaned into him, her hand lingering on his arm, her laughter echoing loud enough to silence any doubt about their relationship. The spectacle wasn't just betrayal, it was a public stripping of dignity for the woman who had given him her loyalty and carried his child. Each display was a dagger, but she held her composure, refusing to let her tears fall where others could see. Behind closed doors, the ache grew heavier, her body already strained by pregnancy now burdened with emotional wounds. Yet, while the mistress thrived on her husband's attention and the wife's humiliation, she underestimated the quiet strength building within the woman she sought to replace. The betrayal cut deep, but it also stirred something powerful, an unspoken promise that her story would not end in shame. It was a warm evening, the kind of night meant for serenity, with lanterns glowing around the poolside and the sound of water rippling softly under the moonlight. Yet, beneath the peaceful setting, tension simmered like a storm ready to break. The wife had gathered her courage to confront him, her voice trembling but firm as she questioned his absence, his arrogance, and the humiliation of his public displays with the mistress. She spoke not with anger but with desperation, her hand resting on her swollen belly as if to remind him of the life they had created together. The millionaire, however, saw her words not as pleas but as accusations. His pride, already wounded by his own insecurities, twisted her concern into an insult. His face hardened, his voice rising until his shouts echoed against the stone walls. He accused her of weakness, of being ungrateful for the life he provided, blind to the fact that it was her love and loyalty that had always sustained their marriage. His arrogance swelled with every word, drowning out reason, until fury controlled his every action. She stood her ground, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, determined to protect her children even if it meant enduring his cruelty. But in that heated moment, he snapped. With a sudden, violent shove, his hands pressed against her shoulders, sending her stumbling backward. Time seemed to slow as her body, heavy with the weight of pregnancy, lurched toward the shimmering blue water. Her gasp cut through the night air before the splash silenced everything. The water swallowed her whole, cold and merciless, dragging her beneath its surface. Panic surged as she struggled, the weight of her unborn child making every movement a desperate fight for survival. Her heart pounded, not just for herself but for the fragile lives inside her, her mind screaming that this could not be the end. Above, the millionaire froze, the reality of what he had done flickering in his eyes, but pride and rage kept him rooted, unwilling to show remorse. He stood there, chest heaving, as the ripples spread across the pool like a chilling reminder of his betrayal. In that moment, he had crossed a line no wealth, no power, no charm could erase. He had not only betrayed her love, he had endangered the lives of his own flesh and blood, revealing the monstrous truth hidden beneath the glittering facade of his success. The shock of the cold water burned her lungs, but instinct and sheer will kept her moving. With every ounce of strength, she fought to surface, her arms thrashing until at last she broke through, gasping for air. Her body trembled, her soaked dress dragging her down, but her determination to protect her unborn child gave her power beyond her fragile state. Hands shaking, she gripped the pool's edge, pulling herself out with a desperate resolve, collapsing onto the stone as water streamed from her hair and gown. Her breaths came ragged, her heart pounding not only from the struggle but from the horrifying realization of what her husband had done. He had crossed a line no wife should ever have to face, choosing cruelty over love, selfishness over family. For a moment, tears threatened to fall, but she held them back. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her broken. As he turned away with a cold sneer, leaving her to shiver under the night sky, she understood that confrontation would be useless. Words would not pierce the armor of his arrogance. Instead, she chose silence, not the silence of defeat, but of strategy. She would recover quietly, gathering her strength, nurturing her unborn child, and waiting for the moment when her hidden power would eclipse his arrogance. Behind her calm exterior, a storm brewed. She would no longer beg for love or understanding. She would protect herself and her future with a strength he could neither control nor predict. Survival was not just about breathing, it was about patience. And in her silence, she carried the weight of a plan that would one day turn his betrayal into his downfall. The millionaire's descent began slowly, almost imperceptibly, before spiraling into chaos. Blinded by his ego, he poured money into reckless ventures, convinced that his instincts alone guaranteed success. Deals that once seemed promising slipped through his fingers as he ignored the advice of seasoned partners, dismissing caution as weakness. Each failure was masked with bravado, each loss excused as temporary, but the cracks in his empire widened with every careless move. Instead of focusing on rebuilding stability, he turned his attention to the mistress who fed his pride with flattery. She whispered promises of loyalty and admiration, her laughter a balm to his wounded ego, but behind her charm was hunger for his wealth and status. He mistook her indulgence for devotion, leaning on her more heavily as his wife's quiet presence faded into the background. Together, they flaunted their luxury, squandering resources on extravagant parties, designer wardrobes, and lavish getaways, while his financial foundation weakened. Greed gnawed at him, clouding his judgment until every decision became a gamble. He could not see that the empire he had once boasted about was slipping through his grasp, or that the woman he trusted at his side was more interested in his fortune than his future. With each passing day, arrogance drove him further into ruin, isolating him from allies, family, and the stability he had taken for granted. What he thought was power was nothing more than a crumbling facade, and though he could not yet see it, his unraveling was nearly complete. Her silence had never been weakness, it was preparation. While the millionaire wasted his days flaunting wealth and chasing pleasure, she sat quietly in the background, making calculated moves that would change everything. Bit by bit, she began to let the right people see who she truly was. A trusted banker received an unexpected call, not from the millionaire, but from her directly. A meeting with a board member was arranged under the guise of casual conversation, yet by the end of it, they left stunned by her insight and financial acumen. The whispers began almost immediately. Could it really be her? The elegant, quiet wife everyone assumed was nothing more than a trophy? Slowly, she peeled back the layers of her hidden identity, revealing the empire she had built in silence. Accounts, assets, investments, all hers, carefully structured and shielded from her husband's reach. To the outside world, he was the tycoon, the powerhouse. But in truth, her portfolio surpassed his instability and reach. Her allies grew, men and women who had dismissed her before now seeking her counsel. The shock in their eyes fueled her strength, reminding her that she had never been powerless, only underestimated. Each revelation spread like ripples in water, shaking the foundations of the illusion her husband had built. When the mistress caught wind of these murmurs, her smile faltered. The woman she had mocked, the wife she thought defeated, was not only surviving but rising in a way that neither she nor the millionaire had anticipated. The balance of power was shifting, and the cracks in their arrogance widened as her truth came to light. For the first time, the millionaire's name no longer commanded the unquestioned respect it once had. Behind closed doors, conversations turned toward her, the quiet investor whose moves were suddenly the talk of boardrooms and backchannels. She had waited patiently, and now her time had come. The truth of her identity was no longer a secret. It was a revelation, and it was only the beginning of his downfall. The facade of devotion the mistress had so carefully constructed began to crumble the moment her comfort was threatened. At first, she had played her role flawlessly, adoring partner, loyal confidant, the one who stroked the millionaire's ego when the world seemed to turn against him. But as whispers of the wife's growing influence spread, her mask slipped. Her ambition, once cleverly disguised, revealed itself in sharp remarks, restless demands, and a desperation that could not be hidden. She began pressuring him for larger gifts, properties in her name, business stakes that secured her independence, extravagant jewels that drained what little stability he had left. Behind closed doors, arguments erupted, her tone shifting from sweet to scathing as she reminded him of the risks she had taken by being with him. To outsiders, she clung tightly to his arm, smiling for the cameras, but those closest began to notice the tension in his jaw, the weariness in his eyes. The final cracks appeared when evidence of her manipulation surfaced, financial discrepancies traced back to her, secret conversations with rival investors, and whispers of her entertaining other wealthy suitors. What he had believed to be loyalty was nothing more than opportunism. His empire, already weakened by greed and arrogance, now suffered under the weight of betrayal from the very woman he thought stood by his side. For the wife, watching from the shadows, this unraveling was not surprising. She had always known the mistress's devotion was a mask, and now the world was seeing it too. The humiliation that once belonged to her now shifted to them, exposing their affair for what it truly was, nothing more than lies built on sand, collapsing under the truth. The moment of reckoning arrived quietly, but struck like thunder. For months, the millionaire had strutted through life believing he was untouchable, his wealth, his connections, and his arrogance shielding him from consequence. Yet when the wife's true identity as a formidable investor surfaced, the balance of power shifted in an instant. No longer was she the quiet, devoted woman standing in his shadow. She emerged as the very force controlling the strings of deals he thought he dominated. Suddenly, boardrooms whispered her name with reverence. The same men who once praised him now sought her approval, their respect gravitating toward her sharp intellect and discreet empire. Invitations that once landed on his desk arrived in hers, and powerful allies aligned themselves with her vision. Financially, she eclipsed him, holding investments and shares that gave her influence over his failing ventures. Socially, she stood untarnished, a figure of resilience and quiet triumph, while his reputation lay in tatters. The irony was not lost on anyone. The man who had flaunted his mistress, dismissed his wife, and pushed her to the brink of death now found himself beneath her gaze, powerless and desperate. Every step she took radiated strength, her presence commanding rooms he no longer had the privilege to enter. This was her turning point, not just survival, but ascension. And with every revelation, the world watched the tables turn, realizing that the true power in their story had never belonged to him. It had always been hers. The downfall of the millionaire was swift and merciless, like a storm tearing through everything he had built on arrogance and deceit. Once celebrated as a symbol of success and influence, he now stood exposed, stripped of the image he had so carefully crafted. His reputation crumbled when the truth of his betrayal, cruelty, and recklessness emerged, whispered first in hushed tones and then shouted openly in public forums. Society, which once applauded him, turned its back, and the same admirers who once envied his lifestyle now viewed him with scorn. Financially, the collapse was devastating. With his wife's secret identity revealed as a powerful investor, she controlled key assets and connections that he had always taken for granted. Business partners withdrew, deals fell apart, and the mistress who once clung to his side vanished the moment the wealth dried up. The empire he had flaunted became nothing more than a hollow shell, his greed and poor decisions leaving him cornered and helpless. The humiliation cut even deeper than the financial ruin. Once the life of every party, he was now excluded from social circles, his name a cautionary tale, whispered in gatherings he could no longer attend. The same arrogance that once fueled his rise became the reason for his isolation, as no one wanted to associate with a man whose mask had been ripped away so publicly. Alone, disgraced, and without the wealth or power he once wielded, the millionaire was forced to face the reality he had long ignored. True strength, respect, and legacy had never been his. They belonged to the very woman he had underestimated, betrayed, and tried to destroy. His fall was complete, and there was no way back. In the aftermath of devastation, the wife emerged not as a victim, but as the embodiment of resilience and quiet strength. What her husband had once dismissed as fragility had revealed itself to be an unshakable core of power. She carried herself with grace, her pregnancy no longer overshadowed by fear but illuminated by the certainty that she had secured a future not just for herself, but for her unborn child. The poolside betrayal that could have ended her life became the turning point that defined her legacy. Surrounded by loyal allies, family, and a circle of respect that had once belonged to her husband, she embraced the fullness of her identity as both mother and investor. Her empire, built silently, piece by piece, away from the arrogance of her husband, now stood firmly in the open, admired by those who had once only seen her as an accessory to his success. She was no longer defined by the role of a devoted wife, but by her vision, her courage, and her refusal to be broken. The millionaire's downfall only amplified her triumph. Where he had chased empty pleasures, she had invested in purpose. Where he had chosen betrayal, she had chosen patience. And where he had tried to destroy her, she had risen even stronger, ensuring that his cruelty would never dictate the course of her life again. The world now recognized her not as the woman behind the man, but as the woman who stood above him. In the quiet moments, she held her growing belly and whispered promises to the child who had survived the chaos with her. She would protect them, nurture them, and raise them to understand the values her husband had lacked: loyalty, integrity, and compassion. Her legacy was no longer tied to the hollow image of wealth her husband once paraded, but to a future rooted in love, wisdom, and power earned through perseverance. Her story was no longer about betrayal and pain, but about victory and renewal. As she walked into her new life, she carried with her the undeniable truth: strength often hides in silence, and when revealed, it can reshape everything. She had risen above, and her legacy would endure.